Now I'm opening my file. Yes. So welcome everybody. So today I'm speaking as a postdoc researcher at the Vienna Center for Reconciliation Studies. At our center, we work on reconciliation on different levels, as Professor Leiner has shown. One level we are working on is the reconciliation with oneself. And today my presentation's title is How Employment and Meaning Making Foster Reconciliation with Oneself. So I start with some considerations from philosophy of time, then I will turn to a short concept of trauma, and then I will land to some philosophical remarks based mostly on the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur about these two notions, employment and meaning making. Our ordinary understanding of temporality considers time as the flow of a constant becoming. As a ceaseless production of future, we visualize time as a forward-oriented arrow. Along this way, we understand time as something irreversible. Yet, we possess another access to temporality, which is related to its internal consciousness. It is the so-called lived time, whose most dramatic form can be found in the event and in the aftermath of trauma, whereby irreversible time is related to a ceaseless and continuous flow. This is our understanding of time, our ordinary understanding of time. Lived time of trauma, from the other side, is connected to a single instant, experienced as something insurmountable and indestructible. The French-Lithuanian philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich has defined this further dimension of time as the irrevocable. The irrevocable time is based on the recognition, on the indestructible ipseity of what has been in the single instant of its having taken place. As such, irrevocable time bursts in the middle of the irreversible time, breaking it up so that nothing is like it was before. And my first assumption in this presentation is that traumatic events, from a moral philosophical perspective, can be understood as paradigmatic examples of irrevocable time. They appear as irrevocable and epoch-making, but at the same time, in a kind of tragic irony, cannot be remembered in a clear and articulated way. And I find this point very fascinating and very enigmatic, that at the same time, something that is irrevocable, so something that is unforgettable from a moral perspective, here from a psychological perspective, is something that cannot be remembered in a clear and articulated way, and yet it is so imposing itself. Affecting memory, traumatic events recur as flashbacks in the present, as an unpredictable, overwhelming intrusion, which causes a systematic loss of capabilities and agency on multiple levels. Loss of one's ability to remember and to describe the suffered atrocities, loss of control on one's life, finally, loss of one's identity. This happens because trauma impairs the capacity to register the horrific events, exceeding the faculty to integrate them in the continuum of the self, which ties one's memory, one's identity, and one's agency. In other words, breaking the inner life of its victim into an unabridgeable before and after, the grave incident experienced as a trauma tears apart the perceived self-conciliation. South African psychotherapist Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, who was, by the way, a key figure also in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has aptly defined the impact of trauma as enacting a dramatic process of undoing of the self. So here I'm very much interested also on this terminology, the fact that she's characterizing trauma as something that enacts an undoing of the self. Reconciliation, the long-term process to create better relations after suffered atrocities, as we have seen also today in the definition provided by Martin Leiner, consider here as reconciliation with oneself requires to overcome, or at least to face, the dreadful consequences of the undoing of the self due to trauma. Reconciliation with oneself means, therefore, the restoration of a continuum of the self, that link which ties memory, identity, and agency, which has been atrociously damaged and injured by trauma. Therefore, in this context, one thesis is also that there is no reconciliation with oneself without addressing trauma healing. And here, once again, I mean, when I speak about reconciliation with oneself, I speak about the self as a link that ties memory, identity, and agency. And here I consider trauma so important and so central because it injures this connection between memory, identity, and agency. From the perspective of a talking cure, healing the traumatized and consequently fragmented, even dissociated self, as for instance, a psychotherapist like Janina Fischer is doing, speaking explicitly about and healing the fragmented self, mending it into a reconciled one requires an enduring process of elaboration and integration of memories via narrative. It means the work of emplotment and meaning making. Emplotment and meaning making are tightly interwoven. Emplotment is a word that here I take for mostly from the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur and his trilogy Temps et Récit, so Time and Narrative, a trilogy from the 80s. Emplotment is a process of composition that allows regaining sovereignty on one's life by integrating the traumatic event in the continuum of the self. Emplotment takes place via meaning making. Meaning making indeed shapes a new narrative, a more comprehensive one, which makes sense of a traumatic event by inserting it in one's life plot. I quote again Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela's book, Narrating Our Healing. According to the authoress, fundamental is the issue of regaining of meaning after trauma, the rewriting of one's life narrative to incorporate the traumatic loss in the new narrative. End of the quote. This process is related to the hermeneutical dimension of our existence, to the human tendency to regard life as a narrative. To our inner perception, events appear neither in a purely chronological sequence, nor as an arbitrary or even messy collection of ill elements. On the contrary, we feel that one event led to another, that some major events influenced our life development in a certain way, till we reached the place where we stand. From a narrative point of view, events are not just bare or random facts. They become episodes, constitutive parts of a life plot, our life plot, that we weave and reweave via meaning making. Therefore, according to Ricoeur, it is the practice of a narrative identity that can reconcile our fragmented and shattered self. Far beyond any static and unhistorical sameness, which freezes identity as perseverance toward a pre-existing Eden, I think that something that is noteworthy here is the etymological, and not only etymological, connection that relates identity and Eden, and the attempt that Ricoeur makes to overcome such a consideration of identity as perseverance towards a pre-existing Eden. Narrative identity, on the contrary, is not a given one. Enacted via emplotment is a configuring act, an hermeneutical practice which grasps together multiple and scattered events into one comprehensive whole life plot. Actually, here it is introduced a significant novelty, this striving towards wholeness, that, as we will see, it's what makes the difference in reconciliation with oneself. Emplotment is the engine of narrative identity. It unifies the miscellany constituted by circumstances, different goals and means, intentional achievements and pitiable incidents, assessing the primacy of concordance and configuration over discordance and succession, without implying the ideal of a conflictless harmony. I quote from Ricoeur's last book, The Course of Recognition. Emplotment confers an intelligible configuration on a heterogeneous collection composed of intentions, causes, and contingencies. The unity of meaning that results rests on the dynamic equilibrium between a demand for concordance and the admission of discordances. End of the quote. Striving to achieve cohesion, coherence, and constancy over the episodic dispersal of a manifold of occurrences and circumstances, emplotment, lying at the core of narrative identity, fosters reconciliation with oneself as a discordant concordance. So, discordant because made of many elements, and concordance as a synthesis of heterogeneous, by integrating confused, conflicting, and separated events as episodes in a consistent and interwoven life plot. Along this way, the perceived extraneity of an occurrence is now perceived as a moment that belongs to one's self-interpretation. The meaning-making practice operated via narrative identity allows a turning point which goes from alienation to appropriation. The feeling of contingency stemming from an unforeseeable event, paradigmatically disruptive in the case of trauma, can be overcome if it is turned into an integral component of one's life plot, not to speak of a post facto necessity. German psychologist Jens Brockmeier has defined this hermeneutical practice, peculiar of insight, as retrospective teleology. So I find this terminology quite brilliant. A retrospective teleology, a telos, which is a finality that is created by looking back. So there is a shared consensus that meaning-making practices have empowering and healing effects. Narrating our life, for instance, by writing our autobiography, we can perceive the story of our life as at least partially oriented and planned by us, so that we can perceive us as authors provided of agency and self-efficacy. Occurrences are blind without referring to a life plot. This is a very important consideration in the economy of my presentation that is approaching to the end. The occurrences as such are blind without referring to a life plot. Reconciliation with oneself requires to consider one's life as a wholeness, instructed and articulated through a life plan which encompasses and orientates singular practices and actions, reconducting the particular, which is performed here and now, or which it happens here and now, to the universal prescribed by the life plan. According to moral philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre and Charles Taylor, meanings, so crucial in reconciliation with oneself, stem from values. It means values provide the criteria of meaning making that orientate human agency in any given here and now circumstances. The relationship between values, reconciliation with oneself, and life as wholeness is the further step that I will work on my further investigation. For now, thank you very much for your attention. Okay, I'm done.
Yes. Since they approve for Louis, we try to connect this.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Benjamin, I give you
Yes, and I'm just
the chair of moderation.
Okay, so I think it's more.
It's the question.
Okay. Are we collecting questions or the questions are? Yes. I think.
No, this one, and we are transfer for this one for.
Actually, I cannot visualize this.
You can connect. I think you can connect. From
Luis has the control.
Yes, Luis.
Okay. In the meanwhile, if there are some questions about my presentation.
May I have a question to Francesco?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation about reconciliation with oneself. I appreciate a lot. And fragmented identity will be recovered through the process of the reconciliation with oneself. But I want to question, there might be some cases under which reconciliation with oneself could evoke another conflict. I want to show you such example. Maybe in eastern Ukraine, those pro-Russian residents will find such and such. Ukraine and Russia had been a long-time brother, and we are a member of the Ukraine states. But the Ukraine states are imagined as a pro-Russian states or brotherhood state with Russians. In this way, the pro-Russian Ukraine in Eastern Europe, Ukraine would recover himself or herself. But in Western Ukraine, it might be that another type of Ukraine could be imagined, and under the new imagination of pro-democratic or pro-Western Ukraine's image, the person in the Western Ukraine would recover oneself. In the process of recovering oneself, a concept of society or the seems indispensable. In what kind of society I am living? he or she, if he or she would find the new society in which they would be welcomed in the society, then the person could recover from the traumatic events which had fragmented one's own identity for so long times. But if only he find out a new image of society, he would recover one's identity. It's my understanding of your presentations. But if the image itself would be very different, then another type of conflict could be evoked. It's my own argument. In short, in Western Ukraine's the pro-Western Ukraine could be imagined as a pro-Western nations, but in Eastern Ukraine would be the image of Ukraine's nation would be imagined as a pro-Russian nations. So such an imagination would be conflicted, would be in another conflict. I'm sorry to explain my question. Could you understand my questions?
So it is that there is a possible conflict also between the self and the society. So the individual reconciliation and how, and the fact that if I got you right, not necessarily a more reconciled self leads to a more reconciled society.
Yeah, I suppose that recovering oneself might be supported by finding an image of society. I have been accepted in this society, then I should not worry anything about my own identity. Then one's identity would be recovered. But if the image of society would be very different, then the groups would be in another conflict. Wouldn't the new conflict would be evoked? Isn't the new conflict be evoked by the reconciliation of oneself?
Yes. It's also about the
society.
Dynamics of recognition that our perceived inner reconciliation is always related with a recognition that we receive from our social environment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Reconciliation with oneself must be supported by finding an image of society where I am completely accepted. I don't have to worry anything about my traumatic events. In this society, I am safe and I am completely relieved. But if the image of society itself is very different, then isn't the new conflict evoked by the peoples?
Yes, I think it's important to see this dimension that when we speak about reconciliation with oneself, we are always speaking about a context-related subject, and that the way that the subject is experiencing is or relationship to the social environment is very important for the feeling of achieved or missed self-conciliation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Maybe also something to this point.
Yes.
Just to add, I think reconciliation has always a dimension to reconcile with different others, with oneself, with your own group, with also your values, what you're believing in, and all this is always a part of a complex process, and there are sometimes you win something in reconciliation with yourself and you lose something with your former friends or your former colleagues or your former people from your nation. And you have to adjust it and to see how you can find a new balance again. So it's always a moving process. And the ideal goal would, of course, be to have reconciliation in all dimensions and to find really in a global society together where everybody respects everybody and where everybody is respected and can unite reconciliation with oneself, with reconciliation with others in his group and in others' group as well. But this is very much a perspective which we are hoping for and we are aiming at, but which is often in real life difficult to achieve. And sometimes you have to go to phases where you reconcile with yourself and you lose something with reconciliation with others and the other way around. You have to work with this and advance. But it's an interesting research topic, how they are related and connected, supporting or fighting against each other.